and welcome to Vantage Point on News First on this Thursday evening. We've come to you after a fortnight, and well, believe it or not, a lot has happened since then, and specifically in the last week, where we saw a lot of political developments which were somewhat intriguing, somewhat interesting. We renewed ties with some of our neighbors. We also saw some proposals and reports that really shook the diplomatic community here in Sri Lanka. So to discuss all of this, I have with me Dr. Dayan Jayatilaka, a political scientist and former diplomat himself, who was equally shaken by this report. Good evening, Doctor.
Good evening, Mahina. Good evening. Good to have you back.
Doctor, so this report that I'm talking about is the UN report, but let's leave that for a side. Because this is Vantage Point after all, we try to get a sort of an eagle-eye look at what's happening in terms of politics. Now, we saw Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe starting off the week with a visit to India, meeting Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He met Sonia Gandhi from the opposition. He met several key decision makers in the Indian government. He also had a lot of talks with them. They signed a lot of bilateral agreements. Thereafter, we saw the UN sessions commencing, the UNHRC sessions commencing in Geneva. We saw Foreign Minister Mangala Samaraveera, Minister of Justice Vijayadasa Rajapaksa, our permanent representative Ravinatha Ariyasinghe, all going to Geneva to take part in these sessions, which were crucial for Sri Lanka, because a few days later, the Commissioner of Human Rights in Geneva, the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner in Geneva, and more specifically Prince Zaid Al Hussein, tabled a report to the Assembly. And now there's also a report that's coming out, which is the US draft resolution was also published. So all of this, what do you make of this? What do you make of this political / international events that are all entwined with each other that's happening in Sri Lanka?
Well, one thing I make of it, Mahina, is that you're a very good television journalist, because you started with the right question. You started from the right place, which many people don't. You started off with Prime Minister Wickremesinghe's visit to India. While all attention is focused on Geneva, few analysts, few commentators see the importance of that visit to India. So that's the right place to start. And when I look at the visit of the Honorable Prime Minister, I tend to go by, not by Sri Lankan press reports, but by what the Indian press tells me. So what the Indian press tells me is that the most important meeting was the one between the Union Minister of Roads, Mr. Nitin Gadkari, and the Honorable Prime Minister. Now, the Press Trust of India has that report, and it was reproduced in the Business Times. Now, what it says is that the Minister of Roads spoke to the Prime Minister about this huge project they have, which would link India and Sri Lanka through bridge, road, rail, and an underwater tunnel.
And interestingly, I was reading some of the articles that you had published, Dr. Jayatilaka, after that visit, and you had some intriguing revelations there, where you said an underground tunnel. We are not talking about these billions of dollars being given to build roads or railways. It's an underground tunnel. So that's quite serious.
It is, because the cost, now it's in the Indian press, India being a very rich country, has nonetheless applied for a loan from the ADB, the Asian Development Bank. It is so huge, not even India can spend all that money. And it's 5.19, that's 5.19 billion US dollars. Now that's huge. You don't need that to build a road. You don't need that to build a railway. You don't need that to build a bridge. You need that for the underwater tunnel. Now,
What would be the purpose of this underwater tunnel?
Well, Mahina, I don't like to sensationalize. I don't like to speculate. So I'm not going to speculate on what an underwater tunnel might be useful for. I've been told, I read what the local politicians say. And they say, but look, England and France are connected with an underwater tunnel, a famous channel that, we all use. But this begs the question. There aren't French-speaking people of French ethnicity on the English side of the channel. This underwater tunnel and the road rail linkage is not just between any place in India and any place in Sri Lanka. It's between Tamil Nadu, because it's Dhanushkodi Rameswaram, that's the, and Talaimana. It's between Tamil Nadu and the Tamil ethnic northern province of Sri Lanka. That's what the $5.19 billion tunnel is going to connect. It's not, Gujarat or Kerala or, I don't know, Andhra Pradesh, wherever.
If you visit Talamana now, Dr. Jayatilak, you would see the remnants of a railway track there that sort of abruptly ends where the beach begins. So there was a sort of a service back in the day too.
There's a ferry service.
There was a ferry service back in the day. There was a train service back in the day. But that too was with Talamana and between Tamil Nadu. And we saw a lot of Indians traveling to Sri Lanka, a lot of Sri Lankans traveling to India. So why is the tunnel any different?
The tunnel is different because, there's nothing wrong with the train. You can restore what existed. A train ride, a ferry service, that's fine. Why isn't anyone satisfied? Why is the other side not satisfied with that? Why $5.19 billion US? Why an underwater tunnel? And more than that, what happens if there is an underwater tunnel? What happens is, if you spend $5.19 billion US on this, you are physically connecting, not linking, you are connecting, you are physically integrating Sri Lanka as an island with the subcontinent of India. We are then part of, in geographic terms, the Indian subcontinent. We are contiguous after that. We are not separated by 22 kilometers of water, which has been our natural defense. Throughout millennia, we would then be integrated physically, we would be part of the Indian subcontinent. And when that happens, Mahina, I'm not talking about anything inimical, but if you look at other places where that has happened, on the basis of physical integration comes economic, cultural, and eventually political integration. And certainly if you have co-ethnics, 70 million co-ethnics on the other side, and you have their co-ethnics on this side, there is a natural osmosis. Now, it's very different if you have a flight going up and down or train coming, or, that's different. That's just a link. People should be linked to each other. But to establish physical contiguity and make the country part of the Indian subcontinent, especially the sensitivity here is Tamil Nadu in the north of Sri Lanka, then you're setting in motion something. You're changing the tectonic plates that kept the island separate and gave it a separate identity. Identity will also change as the physical connectivity is established through this $5.19 billion project. Now, the PTI report said that secretary level talks on this will commence this October, that's next month. Now, I wonder, has the cabinet debated this? Has parliament debated this? And shouldn't there be a referendum, because we're talking about the very conditions of existence. This is bigger than the Indo-Lanka Accord. It's not something that you can scrap, with a signature. This is changing the conditions of our existence physically. So, to me, that was the biggest single thing that happened last week, not what happened in Geneva. I'm glad you asked me about it. But then there's Geneva.
Yeah, we'll get to Geneva in a little bit. I just want to touch again on Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe's visit to India. Now, this comes at a very crucial juncture because you have the US draft resolution that is out and voting is to happen at the end of this month. Now, previously we saw India always being on the fence, especially during the Rajapaksa regime. We saw India given not the sort of respect that they wanted to be given, or not the sort of accommodation that they wanted to be given. And because of that, we also saw them taking a different stance on Geneva. Do you think Ranil Wickremesinghe's visit to India this time would have changed that, given them that accommodation that they needed?
Well, I think the mistake that Sri Lanka makes is that the pendulum swings too far in one direction and then again too far in another direction, which is ironic because we have a Buddhist culture, and one would have thought that the middle path is where things would settle.
And now, President Sirisena has always said that foreign policy will take a middle path.
I mean, it's a pity that he doesn't seem to have more of a role in foreign policy making, which constitutionally he is entitled to, though the implementation is with the foreign minister. But anyway, now the problem was that, okay, during the war years, Sri Lanka's wartime diplomacy towards India was very good. We had a troika, that's Basil Rajapaksa, Gotabaya Rajapaksa and Lalit Wiratunga, who managed that on behalf of President Rajapaksa. And our post-war diplomacy towards India was not good at all. Now, the result was that India shifted its position in Geneva in 2012. So 2012, 2013, 2014, India did not stand with us, but it is important to recall that last year, 2014, under President Rajapaksa, or may I say even under President Rajapaksa, with the gaps that had opened up in Indo-Sri Lankan relations, India opposed Zaid al-Hussein's office being mandated to carry out this investigation into Sri Lanka. Because when the resolution was moved, there were two votes, not one. One vote was on what is known as OP10, Operative Paragraph 10, which mandated the Office of the High Commissioner to set up this probe. The Indian Ambassador Permanent Rep Dilip Singha spoke, and it was in fact a written presentation, extremely well written, which opposed this international inquiry and said this is unprecedented, this is a departure from the norms of the Human Rights Council, because it's not the Council that's setting up this, it's not going to be conducted by the Council, it's going to be by a bureaucratic office. So India stood with us against this international inquiry last year, even under Mahinda Rajapaksa. So that tells you how bad this inquiry is. Now, what has happened today is that while we should have rectified our relationship with India, which deteriorated very badly, for instance, sending that second Chinese submarine through.
We in fact discussed about that in one of our programs.
Was something that I can only describe as moronic. I mean, it was beyond stupid, because it provoked a response, a predictable response from India. It shifted the balance within Delhi between those who were pro-Sri Lanka, and between the Doves and the Hawks, and it pushed the Indians and the Americans together. So, I mean, one had to be particularly obtuse to have done that, to have allowed that second Chinese submarine through. Now, that having been said, and while reiterating that the relationship with India should have been rectified, I think we have swung too far in the other direction, because we shouldn't even be entertaining this 5.9 billion physical integration into the Indian subcontinent. We should just say no, or we should say our people, we need a referendum on this one. Secondly, the Indian press tells me that CEPA will be, that there's an agreement that CEPA will be concluded next year. Now, that's not what the Sri Lankan press tells us, that's not what the government tells the Sri Lankan press. But the Indian press knows what it's talking about, because their officials don't lie to them. Now, I'm not against CEPA, I'm not for it. I just don't know enough. I'm not an economist. I try not to speak about things I don't know about too well, anyway. But it seems to me that we are doing too many things. The bridge, underwater tunnel thing, SEPA.
And we're doing it, and do you feel like it is being done too fast, in a
too
fast track way?
Too much, too fast.
I also believe that, and I think people in general would believe that we should have a proper foreign policy first in place.
Absolutely.
Before really,
absolutely,
venturing into these fast track long-term plans that we have in mind. But
Mahina, mine is not a critique. I mean, it's not coming from the point of view that, well, the Rajapaksa administration got everything right, because I was one of the sharpest critics of the Rajapaksa administration's foreign policy in its post-war second term. And I don't change my critique one bit. I would even say that at the moment, I'm not advocating that there be a return to the second term Rajapaksa foreign policy, or that such people should be back in charge. I'm talking about the foreign policy aspect of it. I'm happy that Sajin Basagunawardena is not helping make Sri Lanka's foreign policy or implement it. I mean, I think he's where he belongs. But I think that foreign policy is something that requires the best brains available. Now, whatever it is, Professor G.L. Pires, if you have been left alone without Sajin, I mean, you're talking about a Rhodes Scholar. The man is an intelligent person. I wish that Dr. Sarath Amanugama, assisted by Mahinda Samarasinghe because of his experience in Geneva, were making Sri Lanka's foreign policy. Now, they're not Mahinda Rajapaksa people. I would have thought that they would be more in keeping with President Sirisena's line on foreign policy.
Foreign policy in Sri Lanka has always been a question, and because of that we see, as you said, the pendulum swinging in extreme directions.
Yes.
Is the foreign policy weak now?
Yes, yes it is. Otherwise, I mean, look at Geneva.
And is that why we have been dictated to by several countries? And even the UN, we have India dictating terms to us. We have US dictating terms to us. We have China, who we are indebted to. We have the UN, who are now, through this report, sort of having an axe above our head.
Yeah.
Is that because of our foreign policy? Do you think if Mr. Lakshman Kadiragama was here, these things would have happened?
Absolutely not. We wouldn't, we wouldn't have had this discussion. Of course, that means we wouldn't have had much to talk about on our TV show. But if Lakshman Kadiragama had been alive, we wouldn't have been in this mess. There's no question about it. And I think really that if Dr. Sarath Amanugama were handling our foreign policy, I mean, I might have had criticisms, but there would be no question as to the fact that we would have the best brains available handling the problem, and that Sri Lanka's national interest would have been taken into account. That is what is missing here. There is no clear, coherent conception of Sri Lanka's core national interests.
And it is more of a pleasing policy, is it? Where you try to please everybody so that everyone is on your board. And it also stems with the UNHRC, actually, doesn't it? Because Sri Lanka needs the support of these big world powers behind them when it comes to the US
really.
Draft resolution. But that's how foreign policy is perceived or formulated or based on.
That's not the truth.
Day and age.
That's not the truth. The problem with Sri Lanka, certainly in the post-war period, is that if you sketch Sri Lanka as a kind of a caricature sketch, in the last 3 years of the Rajapaksa administration, during what I call the Sajin Vas years, Sri Lanka was like this man with his sort of sarong tucked up and challenging. And now Sri Lanka is like the same man, but functioning as a doormat. So everybody comes and wipes their feet on Sri Lanka. I mean, Sri Lanka must be neither. You don't have to behave like a hedgehog, nor do you have to behave like a cat sort of brushing up against somebody's trouser leg, even if it's, especially if it's the United States of America or the West. You need to be intelligent and dignified. And we can do that. I believe this government can do that. It's not a question of the other government versus this government. We can. But the basic criterion is you must give the most intelligent people, the ones who are most equipped to deal with it, the chance. Now, let's take the present theme. I do not understand why Dr. Harsha De Silva was not sent to Geneva. That guy has his PhD from the United States. He knows how to talk to the Americans. He's the Deputy Foreign Minister. What's he doing back in Colombo? What is the Minister of Justice doing there? I mean, surely, okay, the Foreign Minister went there, he went away. It's Harsha who should be giving the political leadership to this negotiation on the US draft resolution. Why isn't he there? Of course, I don't understand why he isn't the Finance Minister, or why Iran isn't the Finance Minister, but now that he's not the Finance Minister, and he's the Deputy Minister of External Affairs, why isn't he in charge of negotiating with the Americans on the US?
Let's draw attention to Geneva, Dr. Jayatilak. You've served in Geneva, and we saw your work in 2009, the only time Sri Lanka actually registered a victory at the elections. Now, recently, last Wednesday, the inquiry report on Sri Lanka released by the UN Human Rights Commissioner Zaid Al Hussein was given out. It was a 260-page report, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Now, it had a lot of observations and also recommendations. Now, the media has picked on two words.
Hybrid court.
A hybrid court. Nobody saw that one coming. But let's pick on it first, the hybrid court, because that's on the lips of everyone, not just the media, but also the general public. I know you're not really a legal expert, but what would you make up of this hybrid court from a diplomatical perspective?
Well, Mahina, to me, the most serious recommendation is not that, but that's the one that the media is focused on, but we'll get to the more serious stuff when you ask me about it. But if you're talking about the hybrid court, in the first place, the argument itself is wrong. The argument is that Sri Lanka's judiciary is not sufficiently independent, and therefore you need a hybrid court with, I quote, international judges, international prosecutors, international lawyers, and international investigators. Now, Mahina, look, it's not just the Sri Lankan judiciary that has a few things wrong with it. Well, as a country, we have quite a few things that are wrong with our country. Does that mean that we need to hand it back to colonialism? I mean, simply, let's say, you have a kid, there's something wrong with the kid is behaving badly in school. You don't give him or her over to foster parents, especially foreigners. Okay, I'm going to adopt this kid, I'm going to let somebody adopt this kid, he's behaving badly in class or something. That whole argument is ridiculous. Is Sri Lanka's the least independent judiciary in the world? Okay, if you narrow it down to the countries that have been at war, is Sri Lanka's the country that has been at war in which the largest number of people have been killed? No. Is it a country that has invaded other countries? No. Was its war fought by a military dictatorship? No. And of the countries which have been at war in the last, let us say, 10 years, just to pick a date, is it the country which with the least independent judiciary? I don't think so. Now, why then doesn't Prince Zaid Al Hussein point the finger at several other countries and say, hey, you guys, your judiciary is not independent enough, have an international judge? This is absurd. Whatever is wrong with our judiciary.
And there, the focus on international judge, I mean, that is also a very serious sort of recommendation, because we're talking about a hybrid. It's okay if you have legal experts, international legal experts, and we saw that in certain of commissions that were set up after the war. We saw international experts coming in, giving us legal advice, sort of guiding these commissions, because as Zaid Al Hussein says, yes, Sri Lanka does not have the capability to deal with such international human rights violations that are being charged at them. So we do need legal experts. But do we really need international judges as well to judge our actions?
Judges, lawyers, prosecutors, and investigators. That is ridiculous, Mahina. That is ridiculous. I read in the leading Aussie newspaper, The Australian, a piece by a well-known journalist, Amanda Hodge. And Amanda Hodge gives us an inkling as to what the Sri Lankan government may actually settle for, but that again is very alarming. She says that the formula, the final formula seems to be, okay, local judges, foreign investigators. Now, Mahina, that again is ridiculous. There was nobody to do investigation, no foreigners to investigate when our leaders were being blown up by the tigers. We did our own investigations. I remember chassis numbers, SIM cards, all of that being ferreted out by Sri Lankan investigators who then traced the perpetrators. All of that was done by our people. We have the scientific knowledge, and if we want, when we do dig up bones, if we feel we don't have the expertise, we send them to laboratories. We don't need foreign investigators here. Remember what happened in Iraq? International inspection teams. That was the whole WMD thing. And finally, there was no WMD, but nobody bothered. They just bombed the place. So, the idea of foreign investigators, leave alone foreign judges, is absolutely reprehensible. We don't need foreign forensic experts here. If we need the expertise, we can send it, or we can call in whoever we decide to call. It shouldn't be mandated, imposed, and structurally part of any arrangement. Mahina, this is really absurd. We have living amongst us, part of the year is overseas, a judge who was the vice president of the World Court, Justice C.G. Veeramantri. He's very lucid. He's writing the third volume of his autobiography. What on earth is Zaid al-Hussein talking about? If we want some expertise, President Sirisena can always
we have the capabilities. That's what
Justice
you're saying. We have the
to come over.
We have the professionals to fit the bill.
The Singaporean law faculties were set up by Sri Lankans. Okay, 30 years of war has damaged our institutions, but this is an independent country, a democracy. We've never had military rule or any such thing. We've always had civilian control, and our judiciary is quite robust. During the middle of the war, I remember the Chief Justice of that time, Sarathan Silva, gave a decision to remove security barriers from Colombo. And I used that in Geneva. I don't think any American or Israeli judge would have done that. But he just did that. That's how robust our judiciary was, and still is. So, if there's anything wrong with it, I think the 19th Amendment has taken care of it by enhancing or restoring the independence of the judiciary. We don't need any external component in any kind of judicial mechanism.
Now, another recommendation was that Sri Lanka will need more than a domestic mechanism to deal with these human rights allegations. Now, these recommendations were actually welcomed by the opposition leader, Mr. Sambandhan from the TNA. He said that these were good recommendations.
I'm sure he did.
Doctor, is this the sort of mentality of the Tamil politicians in this country, that we do need international investigators, we do need international prosecutors because we have no faith in this system, in our country? Those who have been victimized by the war as well, I'm talking about.
Well, Mahina, the war didn't have victims from only one community. It didn't even have victims preeminently from one community, because who's going to say that? What is the criterion? You had Muslims killed at prayer in the Katankuli Mosque in 1990. How are you going to decide who suffered most, and why do you want to decide who suffered most? Everybody suffered. So, yes, the official stand of the TNA is precisely as you said. They welcomed the idea of international judges, prosecutors, lawyers and investigators. Now, this was always the problem with mainstream Tamil politics. Going back to, the 30s and 40s, there was a tendency not to look inwards, not to look either at the mistakes that had been made within the community, or to look southwards to build bridges, but rather to look outwards and to look towards the West. This is part of the political culture, unfortunately, of
and is that
Tamil
also due to the diaspora influence?
Well, it's a chicken and egg thing, because long before there was a diaspora, that was the main line of Tamil nationalist politics, looking to the West to give them a kind of status that they felt they should have but didn't have numerically in Sri Lanka. And the West initially rejected that. The Solberry Commission very clearly made a statement which maybe one should remember to this day. Lord Solberry's point was, one cannot turn a majority into a minority or a minority into a majority. Democracy doesn't permit that. It's not something that you can do. But unfortunately, the Tamil politicians have not understood that and not accepted that, and they therefore look to the world outside, especially the West, to give them that status that numbers in a democracy do not guarantee. And this is why you have this response, which will not help the degree of acceptance that the TNA has as the official opposition in this country. Because if you take a stand that's seen as going against the country, then you are not, you have a problem of legitimacy. So it's not very advisable, especially when you have 30 to 40 guys from the SLFP who are 3 times larger than the TNA's 16 seats sitting in opposition.
Well, I think we should leave that for a different discussion, because that goes into Sri Lankan politics and the cabinet and all of that. That is left for another day. We're talking about Geneva because that's where we're at. That's where we're wedged in the middle at. And the observations made in Geneva in this OHRC report were quite intriguing. It was quite serious observations. Some of these observations were unlawful killings made by both sides, the armed forces and the Tamil Tigers, extrajudicial killings, sexual and gender-based violence, again from both sides, enforced disappearances, and particularly Tamil sympathizers who surrendered but to the armed forces at the end of the conflict, and the way they were handled. And torture and other forms of degrading acts, forced recruitment of children and adults, that was mostly for the LTTE. These observations are quite serious, and it questions the UN, because some of these observations are mostly targeted at the government of Sri Lanka. If you take the report and look at it, it's mostly about the government of Sri Lanka, the armed forces, and the UN actually deploys Sri Lankan army personnel in its peacekeeping force in several conflict-affected nations. So when you have these sort of observations and these sort of allegations at the armed forces, isn't this ironic, Dr. Jayatilaka?
Well, you know, the charges you listed, to me, those are lesser charges. What's most serious is the term used in the report and also by Zaid Al-Hussein in his verbal presentation of the report. System crimes. See, there's a myth about the report that it's well balanced, it's sober, and it doesn't mention names. And in any case, all this is about a couple of people who gave the wrong orders to the armed forces. That's not what the report says. That's not what Zaid Al-Hussein says. What he says is that there were international crimes, which he describes as crimes of interest to the international community. War crimes, crimes against humanity, violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And who did this? One person? Two people? Bad guys? No. He uses the term system crimes. Now that's deadly serious. He's talking about the Sri Lankan state system. What other system is there? And in fact, in his verbal presentation, he said the Sri Lankan state, and he said state actors. And then he paused, and then he said, and not only by state actors, but also by the LTTE. So the LTTE is a lesser offender. And when he was asked in the Q&A, when he was asked why they didn't name names or implicate the people directly, he said because, this is interesting, is that because we think that it's more important to see what the institutional and command level responsibility, because we think that these were matters of policy by the institutions and the system as a whole. In other words, the whole Sri Lankan state and the Sri Lankan military. Now, they're going for the Sri Lankan state. Now, the proof of that is on page 251 of the report, where the recommendations are. Of course, as we know, the media is focused on the hybrid core. But recommendation 36 comes under the subheading to the United Nations system and member states. That means all 193 countries of the world. Recommendation 36 says, whenever possible, to investigate and prosecute under universal jurisdiction, and said notably under universal jurisdiction, credible allegations of violations of human rights and so on and so forth. In other words, the report urges all countries in the world to look at Sri Lanka, and if there's anybody against whom you think there's a credible allegation, then your courts in those countries, in 193 countries, are urged to initiate prosecutions against Sri Lankans. This is the first time, Mahina. It's not being done about Israel after Gaza. It's not being done about anybody else. This is the first time that the Office of the High Commissioner issues a report in which it is recommended. Now, this is the so-called balanced, even-handed report according to some people.
Including the foreign minister.
Including the foreign minister. I was trying to be diplomatic. Good for you. Yes. And for the first time, the Office of the High Commissioner issues a report and recommends that 193 countries of the United Nations initiate investigations and prosecutions.
So why such scrupulous attention on Sri Lanka, Doctor? Why is Sri Lanka used as a sort of a guinea pig in a test laboratory to come under the microscope? Why Sri Lanka when there are so much of allegations that are made against the US? We can see it on CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera every day. Refugees trying to climb onto trains from a tiny window. Children washing up on shore. Because of the situation in the Middle East, main actors in that is the US. So why is Sri Lanka coming under the microscope? Why is there such attention and such a hard stance on Sri Lanka, a country that was successful in ending the war and creating a peaceful environment for its people to live in?
Well, Mahina, I must say President Zaid al-Hussein himself confirms that Sri Lanka is being singled out. Because in his verbal presentation, his first sentence was, this is the first time that such a report has been presented. And then in the Q&A, he refers to the report as rather unique. Now, Mahina, my question is, why isn't Sri Lanka taking exception to that? I mean, we are being told that this is the first time this is being done, which means we are being singled out. Are we the most hideous offenders? Did our war kill more people than any other recent war? I mean, what is it that we did so wrong? That for the first time, of all the countries in the world, we are singled out. Now that alone, Mahina, is discrimination. That's the word for it. We are being discriminated against. We are being singled out. We are being picked upon. Now why doesn't the Sri Lankan government say that? Look, we can't accept this because there is discrimination.
Why is the Sri Lankan government not making any comment? What is the reason? Is this because they feel that there is this sort of a game going on in Geneva where the UN is being harsh on them, but they're hoping the United States, their resolution would be a bit better, a more milder one this time? what is the game that's being played in Geneva, Doctor? And you've been in Geneva, you know these games that are being played. So why is Sri Lanka, what game is Sri Lanka trying to play here?
Well, you know,
or what role in this game is Sri Lanka trying to play?
Prince Zaid says the report is rather unique. I would say that the response of the Sri Lankan foreign minister and the government is also rather unique, because I've never known anybody to roll over and play dead when one's country is singled out for this kind of ghastly accusation. You know, and it's not true. It's not true that names aren't named. There are 22 names in that report. You know what they do? They say, okay, incident, and by the way, one of the allegations against us by Zaid al-Hussein verbally and in the report is indiscriminate shelling.
Especially hospitals.
Yeah, you know, pick the hospital, shell the place indiscriminately, and it also says that the tigers, yeah, there were tigers in the hospital, but they weren't carrying arms. And yeah, it may be the case that there was some tiger artillery around the hospital. But they say, the Sri Lankans say that they had UAVs, drones, spotter drones, and therefore we can only conclude that this is really deliberate because they had the UAVs. Now, Mahina, the Americans have Predator drones. They have UAVs. They have real-time eyes on the battlefield, and so many civilians die in drone strikes. In drone strikes, we don't have that kind of technological capacity. But the report says that because we had a couple of old UAVs, we were quite deliberate. It was policy that we indiscriminately shelled hospitals and killed people. Now, why are we rolling over? What they do is they name armed forces. They name 22 names, including the head of the Special Forces Brigade at that time, Atula Kodipili, including colonels. They do this way. Instead of saying, we think so-and-so is responsible for the crime, instead of a direct allegation, that's how they don't link the name directly to the crime. What they do is, they say crime, this took place here. Puthumadalan Hospital was indiscriminately shelled. The unit that was in the area in which this division was. So they named the division. Then they named the commanding officer of the division. And not only the divisional commanders. They do a chart, and in the chart has drop-down boxes, so you have right down to the battalion level. And they name people right down to Colonel Ravi Priya, Colonel somebody else. 22 names are in that. So it's a lie. When the government of Sri Lanka says, oh, there are no names, either they need a pair of reading glasses, or they're lying to the Sri Lankan people.
So why is such a reaction, Dr. Jayatilaka, a rollover and play dead reaction, as you say?
Well, frankly, I think it's the way the new government sees itself and sees Sri Lanka. Because you have to, I don't want to trash people or parties, so I just take the pieces of the jigsaw. And I can see nobody raising questions or saying, hey, look, we can't just go ahead with this 5.19 billion physical connectivity to the Indian subcontinent, especially with Tamil Nadu. We got to think about this, is very serious. Sorry, talk to me in the second term. Nobody's saying that about SIPA. We need a wider, no, I'm not committed to signing this next year. The whole idea about Geneva was the Americans are going to bail us out. Let's wait for the US resolution. The US is there. We are going to work with the Americans. And now
that again, as you said, the pendulum swinging extremely
absolutely
to the other direction.
Yeah.
I mean, initially during the previous regime, there was no such close connection with the US. But now we see more dependency on the US.
Yeah. But mine, I have to say, in 2009 in Geneva, we were talking to the Americans. I remember, Mohan Piris, he was not Chief Justice at the time. We brought him in on our delegation. And as he landed, I said, Mohan, we're talking to the Americans. Please sit with them. I'm busy. I'm talking to the other countries. And if there's anything that's acceptable to us that they want included in our resolution, go ahead. So we did talk to the Americans in 2009. You have that all in WikiLeaks as well. We had a channel open. Later, during the Sajin Vas years, I don't know what happened. He thought he could bribe the Americans or browbeat them or whatever. Some stupid thing happened in the last 3 years. But anyway, I think they just went a little cuckoo. We were, now it's all, no, the Americans will bail us out. But by this morning, I see that in Geneva, Sri Lanka has woken up because it's seen the American draft resolution. Now the American draft resolution calls in its operative paragraph 15 for the demilitarization of the north and east of Sri Lanka. It also refers to what Foreign Minister Samaraweera said in Geneva and says, yes, as the government of Sri Lanka has promised, we support the repeal of the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And it goes further. It says that anybody against whom there is a credible suspicion, that's not proved in a case of law, Mahina, there's a credible suspicion that he or she violated human rights during the war, i.e. of Black Tigers. I mean, I hope they did violate the human rights of Black Tigers. They should not be retained in the armed forces, i.e. sack anybody and everybody who served during the war and fought for their country, who might have violated the human rights of the Tigers. If you suspect that they violated the human rights of the Tigers, sack him. That's in the US draft resolution. Now that is what Sri Lanka was told was, these are our friends and they're going to save us. So that's all we have to do. Who spoke for us in Geneva yesterday? Cuba, Pakistan, Russia, China.
Japan also spoke for us in the initial stages.
So now we are having to rely on our traditional friends. Now you know who your friends really are. But the foreign policy had shifted to a point that it was just unipolar. And the world is not unipolar. The world is multipolar. It's getting more multipolar by the day. But the Sri Lankan foreign policy mindset of the government was unipolar. Washington or Washington and London. That's all we need to do. We just need to sort of worship them and they're going to take care of us. Well, they're not going to take care of us. What they want us to do is way beyond what even this government can safely do.
Dr. Jayatilaka, now, when this report came out, not the US draft resolution, but the OHCHR report came out, the reaction from the government was that it's not as harsh as we expected it to be.
It's a well-balanced report.
It was a well-balanced report.
Well-balanced.
And we will even welcome whatever recommendations that are made. Even the hybrid court.
It was in the spirit in which the government of Sri Lanka is moving. That is what the foreign
Even the hybrid court, we will look at that possibility. It was very accommodative, the way Sri Lanka reacted to this resolution, or sorry, this report. Now, recently, you're not working in Geneva anymore, but still, you, Tamara Kunanayagam, who also served in the diplomatic service, Professor Rajiv Vijay Singha, P. Ananda Sangari, and several other individuals.
Chris Dharmakirti, who was one of our experts at the UN Law of the Sea conference,
drafted a letter to the President stating that we have a solution to this problem, we have an answer to these allegations, and that is in this report, and that is the International Advisory Report based on the second mandate of the Presidential Commission on Missing Persons, aka the Paranagama Report.
Correct.
And there are also several other reports done based on investigations conducted domestically. And this was under the legal supervision of Sir Desmond De Silva, QC, Professor David Crane, Sir Jeffrey Nice, and Major General John Holmes.
Correct.
You urged...
The former commander of the British SAS, by the way.
You and these other individuals urged the President to fling this report at the UN and tell them, look here, we have done what you are telling us to do, and we have already done it through a domestic mechanism. Now the President is going to speak at the United Nations General Assembly later on this month. How do you think the President should tackle these allegations, these recommendations, and also take your requests into account?
Well, Mahina, we wanted to engage constructively and make a constructive intervention based on our experience, which in the case of Tamara, Rajiva and myself, this has been successful experience in Geneva. And we point out to the President that we have an option. It's at hand. None of us wants to play politics. I mean, we don't want the government to make a mistake and then for us or somebody else to be able to reap political capital. We want this stopped in the interest of the country. Now, what we're saying is, Mr. President, you have something with you. Maybe your advisors haven't told you about it, but it's there. What is this? Now, the Maxwell Paranagama Commission of Inquiry into Disappearances had two mandates. The first mandate was 2013-2014. But the second mandate is important. Why? Because we brought in as advisors internationally credentialed, top class people as an international experts group. Sir Desmond De Silva, Queen's Counsel, and Jeffrey Nice were prosecutors in the Milosevic trial. Okay? And Sir Desmond also was a prosecutor in the Charles Taylor trial. So these are not people who just whitewash governments or states. They've been on international tribunals. As I said, John Holmes was the former commander of the British SAS. He knows what war is about. Professor David Crane, I mean, these are top experts. Now, they prepared a report, the Paranagama report, with it's Sir Desmond's 500-page report. August 2015, that's when the mandate ended, last month. It's a 500-page report, and what it does is, it brings to bear their expertise in international law, which is far vaster than that of Zaid al-Hussein and the people in that office, or Mati Atisari or Azba Jahangir or whoever else they have with them advising them. These are stellar talents, top people. They've taken the international law. They pointed out that the Sri Lankan government, the Sri Lankan military did not intentionally commit war crimes. They've analyzed international law. They pointed out that the Tigers committed a war crime by human shielding. They pointed out to the context in which the last operations took place and argued that the Sri Lankan military had a right and a duty to save those civilians, and in order to do that, they had to use the means at hand, and that these were in fact proportionate, because the principle of proportionality is very important. Whether the military means were proportionate to the intended outcome. And what they have done is they have gone beyond that, and they have said, yes, there were some crimes, and these are the crimes, like the NLRC did. These are the individual crimes, and they have suggested a purely domestic process and a roadmap which can address those individual crimes. But these are not, as they pointed out, they've analyzed the whole thing and they've said this is not the system, this is not the military as a whole, this wasn't policy. Now, President Sirisena and Prime Minister Wickremesinghe have that report. We should have tabled it in Geneva when this session started. We could have intercepted the Zaid al-Hussein report. But we didn't. We could have used this as a shield, but we didn't. Now, I don't understand why. But that's all right. Let's do it now. Because now you have Zaid al-Hussein's report. You have the American resolution, which is not in the interest of Sri Lanka, which is far in excess of what we need to do. And we don't have anything else. With this report, we can rally the majority of the council, and I'm speaking not only as Sri Lanka's former permanent representative and, who was there when we won, but as a former elected vice president of the United Nations Human Rights Council. Now, we can get a deal that is in favor of Sri Lanka. We can use this report, we can tell the countries, we table it and we say, look, let's take this time. Let's study both reports. Let's come back next time. Because we have a domestic process and this is the product. And these are top people, international law experts. Or if you want to, let's do it this time. But here is our countervailing report. And let's negotiate. Let's talk Turkey on that basis. Let's negotiate and hammer down, whittle down the American resolution, move amendments, get our supporters. Most of those countries in that council are from Asia, Africa and Latin America. we can get their support, we can get India's support, and we can produce a text that is far more in favor of Sri Lanka. Why don't we do that?
Was this report, this Paranagama report, or even the Udalagama report, were these reports not tabled in because they were done during the previous regime? Is that something to think about?
Well, that's absurd. In the first place, the Udalagama report, the previous regime should have publicized it. It didn't. That was one of the faults of the previous government. So why doesn't this government rectify it? And that Udalagama report was about those killings in Trincomalee. And we should have done something about that. And the Maxwell Paranagama Commission, of course, was appointed by the previous government, and the previous government finally did something right by bringing in these international experts. As I have been arguing, I've been talking about Sir Desmond, I think, on this show and in the media for years. They finally did something right, and the product is something that the new government inherits. It's a harvest of something right, just like they've inherited the harvest of a successful war and of infrastructure development. So what's wrong with using this?
Dr. Jayatilaka, briefly, if you could tell me, the present government said that, you know, it has been commended by the international community for holding elections in a democratic manner, for democratic presidential elections, and the change that has come about politically in Sri Lanka. Do you feel that these regime changes have some sort of effect on the substance of these reports? Can they change the substance of these reports?
Well, if there is such a high degree of appreciation of the democratic changes that have been made in Sri Lanka since January 8th, there shouldn't have been this recommendation to charge us in all the courts in the world. Recommendation 36. I mean, this is something you do to an enemy. It's not something you do to a country that you think is moving in the right direction. So there's something here that doesn't fit. But of course, I've seen this happen in other parts of the world, Mahina. I've seen this happen. How did Vladimir Putin come to power? Because when Russia was embarking on reform under Gorbachev and Yeltsin, it was never enough for the West. They didn't say, look, these guys are going through a very fraught process, it's a little fragile, we shouldn't pressurize them, we've got to back down. No. The West went at Russia with evangelical zeal. You know, they've got this preachy thing, this, like the missionaries. You know, you have to do this, you have to do it fast. You can't do it in several steps. You have to have a big bang. Now we watch what will happen if we go to the IMF. They'll do the same thing in economics. The same thing is happening in terms of the constitution. We've made promises, Mangala has made promises in Geneva to have a new constitution to satisfy the political aspirations of the Tamil people. Now that's fine, but is that's what a constitution is about? Satisfying the political aspirations of one community? So the West is pushing too far, too fast in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. And that's how they treat friends. They think friends are serfs. They think friends are countries that do when they say jump, the country asks how high. Now, it reminded me of a quote of Che Guevara, which actually he borrowed from Frederick Wilhelm II of Prussia, which is, God save me from my friends, I can take care of my enemies myself. That's what I felt when I read the US draft resolution.
And finally, before we conclude the show, we just got a couple of minutes. We've been talking about this report of the Human Rights Commissioner, and mostly on the sort of observations that it has made, and we've spoken about it from a Sri Lankan government perspective and its impact on the Sri Lankan government. Let's look at the other side and look at the LTTE. Who's going to take responsibility for any of these observations that have been made in this report from the LTTE?
Nobody, because I mean, I don't think they're going to charge Nediavan or whoever. Those guys, the groups that supported the Tigers, they are going to be de-proscribed by the Sri Lankan government, according to Foreign Minister Mangala Samaraweera. Some of those groups that were listed by the previous government should not have been listed. But quite a few were openly pro-LTTE. But we are going to de-proscribe them. So, if we don't raise the issue about the LTTE and ask governments to prosecute these people, why should they? They'll just go for us. We are not defending ourselves. Who's going to defend us?
Thank you, Dr. Jaya Tilak, for joining us on the show today. When we meet again, we'll have more to discuss
Absolutely.
on the Geneva situation. We'll have President Maithripala Sirisena addressing the United Nations General Assembly for his first time as the president of the country. So that is something to look out for. What will he have to say? He has remained on the sidelines. He's actually looked down on what's been happening. Now it will be good to see what he has to say about the report, the allegations, the observations and recommendations made by the UNHRC towards Sri Lanka. Also, the US draft resolution will be voted upon, so we can see again who are the countries who would stand with us and who are the countries that would go against us. So a lot to talk about, and we'll see you again in a fortnight, Doctor. And also for everyone watching us at home, we'll see you again at a fortnight. Keep watching the news and be in the know with the news first. You can also follow this conversation on Twitter. You can be part of the conversation. We would like to hear from you. So if you have any thoughts, questions, please do send it to us, and we'll try to accommodate it on the show here on Vantage Point. So tweet us, go on Facebook, and get involved in the discussion and be part of the voice that is being heard in Sri Lanka. And we can take that voice to the world. So log on to our website, www.newsfirst.lk. If you are unable to catch the show today and you have some work, well, you can always look at the video on our website. Thank you very much for joining us. Good night.